Set to fire again, or will he? He's not going to get it off. He's sacked that time by Trayvon Walker. They finally get home, and their coach hits the turf in celebration.
Almost bobbled the snap. Now fires, and this one is intercepted. Given a second chance, Bonito makes the pick.
On the run, pressure from behind, and that's where Nick Saban is thinking, where's Mac Jones?
He's down, and Tua's down.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here?
You're listening to The Review on the OSG Podcasting Network.
That's right, you are joining The Review. This is the OSG Sports College Football Weekly Review Show, the weekly wrap-up show, but we call it The Review because we can.
Yes.
And we want to give it at least a little bit of a different title. We are the online sports guys, and we love to talk about college football. For those of you not familiar with us, I am OSG Phil. Joining me, OSG Nelson.
Check.
And got a lot of stuff to talk about this week, John. Probably the big talker, the one that's got everybody's attention, is the injury to Tua Tagovailoa. I can
Close.
never say that right.
Why don't you just say Tua, then you'll be fine. Tua Tagovailoa, yeah.
On the run, pressure from behind, and that's where Nick Saban is thinking, where's Mac Jones?
He's down, and Tua's down. His helmet came off. This is exactly what you did not want to see happen.
Pretty bad scene. I guess I should set the situation up for those of you who didn't hear about it, read about it, or see it.
Those of you under a rock.
Alabama cruising in a game against Mississippi State on Saturday afternoon. I believe they were up. I want to say they were up 35-7 going into like less than 2 minutes to go in the first half.
Check.
Nick Saban was ready to take his quarterback out of the game and let him sit and let backup Mac Jones kind of take the wheel from there. But Tua talked his way back in. And, well, that's kind of when the bad things started happening. He went to go roll out for a pass, got hit, player rolled over on him, and Tua suffered what is now called or at least according to ESPN, has been called a posterior wall fracture in his hip. The injury was bad enough that he laid there on the ground crying, basically, and had to be carted off the field and taken to a local hospital. Two defenders fell on top of him. His nose got bloodied up from the hit, and the guy's rolling on top of him. Just a mess. You hate to see that, no matter what you think about Alabama. You hate to see that happen to anybody. This is an injury that more than likely he can recover from, but it ends his season and puts a lot of things in his future in question.
Depending on who you talk to and not being there in the room, there have been some orthopedists who have said that this is the same kind of hip injury that Bo Jackson suffered from. Because if you look at the replay of it, it's when Tua's knee hits the ground and the force of that coming up and the players coming on top of him, and you have that critical mass, and it does what it does for the fracture and the injury of the hip. So obviously done this year, probably the last time we've seen him in a college football game. And now it's just up to what the orthopedists say, what doctors say, what recovery time is. And the questions that have come across the board are, first and foremost, if he was the way that he was after the LSU game, why did he play against Mississippi State? Because you have Mississippi State, you have an FCS team next week, and then you have the Iron Bowl. Why was he even in the game in the first place?
Because he's your starting quarterback.
Right, and so that's, you know, the way that he looked in warm-ups, he passed inspection, so that way he was going to be a part of the offense.
And he played the whole game against LSU.
Right, and he was just after the surgery that he had on his ankle and how LSU figured in that game, the longer that they kept him out and kept him out there running. They knew he was going to be slowing down and he wasn't going to be as effective just coming off of this surgery. So you wondered how the recovery was going to be that week coming off of LSU heading into Mississippi State. With these two games coming up, obviously there's that thought in the back of your head, why start him? But as you say, he's your number one quarterback, and he seemed to be doing all right. He seemed to have talked his way into doing this one last 2-minute drill at the end of the first half. And you saw Mac Jones warming up, so you had a feeling that he was going to play the second half regardless. But now you're going to have a lot of folks sitting here second-guessing Nick Saban and what he was thinking with this game and with the game next week leading into Iron Bowl. And now the other subplot in all of this, other than Tua himself and the recovery and just how healthy he's going to be as a human being. Take the football out of it. You want to see him recover as a person first and foremost.
We've changed the college football narrative.
Yeah. So it's you want him to recover first. Focus on Tua, the person. You want him to recover. Put that aside. Now with the CFP, Alabama's narrative has already begun in some circles about Mac Jones being Cardale Jones and everything, just to keep Alabama in the discussion for the Final Four, regardless of what happens if they win out. Because, yes, you beat a Mississippi State team. Yes, you're going to beat who you play next week. If you run the table, if you win the Iron Bowl, you obviously are not going to be in the SEC championship game. So the question is going to be, do you put a one-loss Alabama into the Final Four if they were not a part of their conference championship game? But once again, if the conference champion is the number one team in the country, there have been multiple times where SEC teams have had two representatives in a Final Four, so it won't be unheard of. But the narrative has already started to keep Alabama in the discussion. And I will send folks to cbssports.com, and if you can find it, it's a Pharrell on the bench discussion that he had with Tim Brando. And Tim Brando last week lit up the college football playoff committee for having all of these blue bloods as a part of the discussion, and that discussion only in the Final Four and not allowing for discussion elsewhere.
And that's something we've talked about more times than I can count.
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes about brand name recognition.
Right.
And what's going to draw tickets sales and what's going to draw eyeballs to the TV when it comes game time. And Alabama they're like the Los Angeles Lakers in basketball. It doesn't matter how good or bad they are. Everybody's going to watch no matter when they play.
Right. And you want to keep them in the conversation, and we've already seen it. And so Brando's main point was that all of the blue bloods and all of the major brands in the business of college football are going to be a part of the discussion. And if you're a quote unquote little guy, you have virtually no shot of getting into this Final Four, no matter how good you are. If you were coming into this weekend, a Baylor, a Minnesota, a team like that, if you're going up against the brand of an Alabama and you're a 5 or a 6, you have zero chance.
That's a given. That's been a given from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
I've said it for years. You can always pick pretty much from between about 8 to 10 teams at the beginning of every season who are going to be the teams contending for that playoff berth, and it's always the same teams, whether they're good or not. And it goes back to the rankings and everything else and how subjective the whole thing is, and that's a whole nother conversation.
Right.
I think Alabama's got a lot working against it, not just Tua's injury. They've got a couple other their frontline players who are kind of banged up this week too.
They were.
They'll probably win the 2 cupcake games. Mac Jones is not a bad quarterback. He's certainly got some skill and some talent and could very well lead them to the 2 wins there. And by no means am I guaranteeing you that that Alabama's going to win that Iron Bowl game. And I think for them to even get into the conversation, not only would they have to beat Auburn, they would have to absolutely dominate Auburn, and I'm not sure they're capable of doing it.
No, not right now, no.
Because despite Auburn losing this week to Georgia in a game that you got to attend, Auburn still, to this day, has one of the best single defensive lines in all of college football. They are not going to be easy to beat.
No, and if you want to sidle into Auburn and Georgia, we can do that.
Which we should.
Okay, so let's sidle into Auburn and Georgia.
Gonna go deep. Got a man out there and get him. Dominique Blaylock. Touchdown.
you figured it was one of the best offensive lines in the country going up against one of the best front sevens in the country.
And it lived up to that hype.
And when Jake Fromm goes 11 of 22 for 110 yards, and it really was a game that was a grinder. And I had anticipated, if this was a game that was going to get into the mid-20s, I would have been both teams into the mid-20s. I would have been completely and totally shocked. But I think that what we saw here was a couple of points. Let's start with Georgia. Georgia, if they were to ever unleash Jake Fromm as a passer instead of just having him be a game manager, we saw instances where Jake Fromm, and this is stuff that you and I have known for 4 or 5 years, that Jake Fromm can throw the deep ball. Yeah, so I think that when they let him in those 1 in 100 instances of allowing him to throw it deep, he can throw it deep.
And he did that early in the game, completing a nice, beautiful pass for a touchdown early on and getting Georgia off the blocks in this game.
Yeah, into basically triple coverage. Christian Tutt was beaten, and you had the three defensive backs there. Threw it among all 4 players. Nicely done. And it was a touchdown on the board for Georgia. So you have that offensive line. DeAndre Swift got close to 100 yards. Most of that was on yards. Okay, so then he got most of that on a chunk play. And if you pull that chunk play away from what DeAndre Swift did, once again, it was a grinding effort offensively going up against that front 7 of Auburn. And when it comes to Auburn itself, and this was something that I've been thinking about a lot, I think that, and I give the boss full credit for this analogy, and I think that it really does hold water. Gus Malzahn, you remember Raiders of the Lost Ark, the movie?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Gus Malzahn is the guy in the fight scene with the knife going up against Indiana Jones.
I don't know about that.
Hear me out. You see the guy with the knife in the fight scene. All he's doing, he's sitting there staring at Indiana Jones in the town square, and he's shifting his knives, and he's being all fancy and doing this. What the boss said is that they needed to be Indiana Jones. Just pull out the gun, shoot the guy with the knife. You don't need to be as fancy as you think you are. For whatever reason, Gus Malzahn, and this is where I come in, Gus Malzahn is outthinking himself entirely. For whatever reason, he's being entirely too cute with his offense and not giving Bo Nix the ability to improvise the way that a quarterback should. He has basically been given an assignment without any wiggle room, and he's not allowed to think for himself. You basically have this play, you do this play, and that is it.
I think that's an over-exaggeration by an incredibly anxious Auburn fan who tends to overanalyze everything and look a little bit too deeply into stuff.
Okay.
I think, in my opinion, for whatever that's worth, I think you're also talking about still talking about a true freshman quarterback in Bo Nix.
No doubt.
Running a not so simple offense to run against a really, really good defensive team.
I still think that Bo Nix specifically is going to make freshman mistakes as an 18-year-old kid.
Yeah, and unleashed or not, the Auburn offensive line was getting beat at the point of attack by the Georgia defensive line. It didn't matter what Gus Malzahn called. They were not going to have a big offensive game in that game.
No.
Yes, they opened things up a little bit in the fourth quarter and managed to pull off some nice chunks of yards as Georgia kind of took their hands off the throttle. But this is more about Georgia imposing their will on Auburn than Auburn just malfunctioning at the wheel.
Okay, well, let's talk about Auburn malfunctioned at the wheel. They've done that most of the season. But here, let me give you another couple of points. First and foremost, I would have maintained that with Georgia's front 7 putting the pressure that they were on Alabama's running game, you weren't getting rushing yards. I think it was 84 total rushing yards for Auburn in that game. Mm-hmm. I would have maintained that the reads at the line of scrimmage should have dictated something along the lines of Bo Nix finding whichever receiver had the largest margin between him and a defensive back, and that should have been his first and only read. catch the ball, dump it off, because that is just as good as a 3 or a 4 yard gain, left guard and tackle. And that in turn should give you spacing to allow for more rushing yards and rushing opportunities as you go.
Right. But you, me, the boss lady, and everybody else don't really know exactly how much of that offense that Bo Nix has a grasp of.
And is allowed to negotiate, yes.
We don't know how much of it he's capable of reading and reacting to in a hurry and how he's going to handle it under pressure. We're assuming certain things there. This was not about Auburn blowing a game. This was Georgia beating them.
And I will also maintain in the fourth quarter that when Auburn played within the rhythm of their offense, did not substitute and played hurry up, what they did is they kept the Georgia defense on the field. Because remember, substitutions, if you substitute, the other guy can. If you come in with a package, then Auburn, in their rhythm offense, keeping the same personnel on the field, just calling different plays, that was when Georgia got tired on those 2 possessions where they gave up scores. Why there wasn't more of that in the game, I don't know. And why it only happened in the fourth quarter, once again, I don't know. But that, to me, seemed the best opportunity for anyone to get anything on Georgia in that game, was being in a hurry-up/rhythm offense and keeping the same personnel and packages on the field.
Yeah, I think if those 2 teams play 25 times this season, I'm pretty sure Georgia wins at least 23 of them. We'll move on to some other games here that were of note, and probably the one that stuck out to me as the most interesting.
Rice beating Middle Tennessee.
Besides that, the Crispies finally getting off the schneid with their first win of the season, and probably the first win in like 20 games, is Oklahoma basically salvaging their season after being down 31-10 at the half versus Baylor at Baylor.
Yeah.
And just absolutely Jalen Hurts literally willing them to a win after one of the ugliest first halves of football that an Oklahoma team's played in years.
Yes. And did you see the tweet that the Atlanta Falcons gave outwardly after the game?
I did not.
Someone made a 28-3 reference, and the Atlanta Falcons had the facepalm emoji on their Twitter account.
Yes. Coincidence, but still.
Yeah.
Great job by Hurts.
Yeah.
30 for 42, 297, 4 TDs, 100-plus yards running the ball. He did what he had to do to get his team back in the game, and the defense was like a completely 2 different games completely, in that Oklahoma basically couldn't stop Baylor or get out of their own ways in the first half. And in the second half, the Oklahoma defense, Alex Grinch must have seen something, made an adjustment of some sorts, or the players just stepped up themselves, but they shut the Baylor offense out completely in the second half.
Yeah, and there was the opportunity for Charlie Brewer. The Charlie Brewer in the second half was definitely not the Charlie Brewer that we saw in the first half.
Brewer almost bobbled the snap. Now fires, and this one is intercepted. Given a second chance, Bonito makes the pick.
And the opportunity that Baylor had in the fourth quarter to make that last game-tying drive, there was something that was thrown out there where Bonito had been rushing the entire night off the edge on 2 consecutive plays, or on consecutive plays. Bonito drops into coverage, and the first interception opportunity that he had in that last drive, he drops. The second time, he drifts back into coverage again, something that Brewer had not picked up. And then so the point was made that Bonito drops the easy one that was thrown right at him, but makes the really difficult interception catch when the second one was thrown there on the out route, where Brewer was trying to get another first down and move Baylor down the field. But
welcome to the world of 19 and 20-year-olds playing football.
Yeah. Hit you in the worst place, right between the numbers. But you have to credit the Oklahoma defensive staff for seeing what they saw in the first half, adjusting, and then getting the pedal down in the second half, making the adjustments that they did to keep Baylor in check in the second half.
Yeah, it was quite the impressive comeback. It may not be enough to get Oklahoma into the conversation when it comes to college football playoff time, but it also salvaged what was left of their season. Speaking of college football playoff level teams, we'd be derelict if we didn't talk about the number 1 team in the country, the LSU Tigers,
Yes.
who put up a humongous number against Ole Miss, but they also gave up a pretty large number against Ole Miss.
715 total yards of offense that LSU had in the game, and I think
Ole Miss had 614.
And John Reese Plumlee. If you didn't know who John Reese Plumlee is going into Saturday, you certainly know who he is now. Responsible for about half of those yards.
212 yards rushing, 4 TDs.
And then another 100-plus passing, so more than 50%. So John Reese Plumlee is now in everybody's spot shadow when it comes to looking at quarterbacks in the SEC.
I guess this begs the question. LSU looks like, in some respects, a more physical version of an Oklahoma team from a few years ago. They're putting up huge numbers on the board every week.
Yeah,
but they're giving them up too.
But at the same time, I mean, last time I checked, if you score more than the other guy, you still win, don't you?
Yeah. It begs the question down the line: what's going to happen when they play a top-flight defense? They've struggled in games where they've played better defenses. Auburn held them to 23 points. That's the one game that really comes to mind, and they're the only ones that really have put a control on them. And quite honestly, Auburn's defense is extremely good.
Yes.
The Tigers finish up with a game versus Arkansas and a game versus Texas A&M. I'm pretty sure those are going to be formality games, especially the Arkansas game.
Yes.
We're looking at now that Georgia's clinched the SEC East, we've guaranteed a Georgia versus LSU SEC championship game, which we'll talk about when we get closer to that game. And it sets up some interesting scenarios as the number 3 team in the world, the college football playoff, whatever you want to call it.
World.
The LSU Tigers keep cruising along, an easy win over the only team of any note in the ACC, a 52-3 win over Wake Forest in a game that really wasn't even that close.
Nope.
Is Clemson going to get tired of doing this to everybody? Is anybody interested or paying attention to them?
No, and they probably won't be until Clemson will be your by the way until the Final Four comes out. And it's like Clemson's like them, because they're in the ACC. And they're just going to have to continue to do what they're doing. They're going to have to. I did not honestly think that they would put up that kind of a number against Wake Forest and that the margin would be 49 points. I thought that it might be.
I didn't either.
I thought it would be a little bit of a showing by Wake Forest other than 3 points. But once again, you see what Dabo Swinney's trying to sit here and wave his hands in the air and go, we're still here, guys. We're not going anyplace, and continuing to deserve their spot in a Final Four.
Yeah, I think Clemson's suffering a little bit from nobody paying attention to the mediocre at best ACC.
Yeah.
Couple interesting games in the Big Ten before we wrap things up here on the first block of the review on the OSG Sports Podcasting Network.
Check.
We have another team that tumbled from the ranks of undefeated it was a game that I kind of, this week in my Dirty Dozen and bottom of the barrel column that drops every Wednesday, I went back and forth on this one. I started to pick Minnesota to lose this game to Iowa because they were playing in Iowa.
Yeah.
And I had second thoughts at the last second and made a change right before I hit publish on the article. Probably shouldn't have done that. Iowa's a tough out at home. A good game, a tough Big Ten kind of slobber knocker type game.
Right.
Iowa takes down the Golden Gophers, knocks PJ Fleck's team from the ranks of the undefeated with a 23-19 win.
Mm-hmm.
Time for Minnesota to come back to earth here, or just kind of one of those fluke things because they were playing on the road after a huge emotional win versus Penn State?
Well, here's where this ended up being one of the worst beats of the season, and I'll tell you why. What was the margin, the final margin in the game?
4 points, 23-19.
Okay, how did it turn into 4 points?
Oh, crap. I think it was a field goal.
It was a miss PAT.
Missed PAT made it a 4-point spread.
So what was the spread from Vegas going into this game?
I don't know because I generally don't keep track of those things since I'm not a particularly good gambler.
3.
Oh, yeah, sure enough. As I scroll down here, I see that. The over being 45.
Yes. So you ended up with a total of 42. And because of a missed point after, everybody who had 3, they got a bad beat. So that's one of the worst.
Lose.
Yeah, pretty much. That was definitely an MXC bad beat right there with a missed PAT. But that's the thing, is that I think a lot of folks saw this as a letdown game for Minnesota because of what happened against Penn State, because of what happened going to Kinnick Stadium, because you're playing at night, because of all of these factors. A lot of folks had Iowa winning this one, and they win it outright. So I think that for PJ Fleck, I think that for them, it's one of those where you sit there and you just kind of dust yourself off, regroup, and understand, okay, we got 1 of 2. Now we just have to take our final 2 games and do what we can heading into whatever postseason there is. But I think that there's a lot for Minnesota to learn from this game in and of itself. Just the snapbacks are going to be hard, especially when folks are gunning for you.
Yeah, the Golden Gophers finish up with Northwestern and then end the season with a game that likely will be for the Big Ten West title against the Wisconsin Badgers.
3 of 4 heading in are going to be rough ones. And so, you're looking at a game against Northwestern where you probably get win number 10. You're 10-1 heading against Wisconsin, and all you have to do is stop their John Deere tractors and 18-wheelers that they have disguised as offensive linemen.
What do you say we take a brief time out here on the review? A little chance for us to kind of catch our breath and regroup a little bit. And we come back. We'll talk about a couple of extra games going on, a little bit more of the fallout, some look ahead to some big games coming up in the following week, and what we think the college football poll is going to look like, playoff poll is going to look like in just a couple of days. Stay tuned, everybody, for that and more when we come back here on The Review. You are listening to the OSG Sports Podcasting Network.
The online sports guys would love to hear from you. Go to our Twitter page at OSG Sports for a comment, rant, or just whatever's on your mind about college football.
Soccer Down Here is sponsored by Apolinski & Associates, LLC, personal injury lawyers with over 30 years of experience. Call Steve Apolinski at 518-350-4231 or email him at steve@aa-legal.com if you need help with a wrongful death or serious injury matter. Steve Apolinski is rated one of the top 100 trial attorneys in Georgia, recognized as Legal Elite by Georgia Trend magazine for being one of the most effective lawyers in Georgia.
If you want to scale a mountain, buy boots. If you want to turn your crush into something more, say hi. At Country Financial, we know protecting the things you love and preparing for tomorrow start with simple steps. So we help you take small steps today with insurance and financial services that can have a big impact on your family's future.
For all your home, auto, and life insurance needs, call Jason Wright at 678-568-6871.
Lighten up, Francis.
Thanks for sticking around, everybody. You have hit the second block of the review. It's the OSG College Football Show, where we take a look back at the weekend in college football action and peek ahead a little bit on what's coming up in the following week. I am OSG Phil. Joining me, as always, OSG Nelson.
Check.
Jay Wilkerson, 16. Brother Wilkie had some family commitments. He couldn't make it this week, but make sure you tune in during the week as he drops the rivalry and trophy game show.
And the debrief.
And the college football debrief. The rivalry and trophy game show, that hits every Thursday morning, and that's where we talk to teams playing in games, traditional rivalries, playing for some oddball trophies, some great backstories and battles in the world of college football, stuff that you really should tune into to get you away from the games and talk of the college football playoff. All that and more right here on your OSG Sports Podcasting Network and on the phone app. You can find us for free on the Google Play Store. You're showing me an empty. There it is. At the Google Play Store and on iTunes, look up OSG Sports. You'll find us there. Of course, we're on Facebook and Twitter at OSG Sports. John, a couple of interesting games that we didn't really get into in the first block, partially because there are more teams to talk about in the bottom of the barrel. Teams that have let's say, gotten off the schneid this week.
Yes.
One of our all-time favorites, the Rice Krispies, the Rice Owls, whatever you want to call them.
Aston Walter makes a man miss, cuts back up the middle, and there he goes. Aston Walter to pay dirt.
Rice got a win.
Unreal. Beat Middle Tennessee State.
They beat Middle Tennessee State. Not only did they beat Middle Tennessee State, they beat Middle Tennessee State in Murfreesboro.
Strong.
31-28. Ending a God knows how many game losing streak.
11 billion.
11 billion. Thankfully, their cohorts at the very bottom of the barrel, the Akron Zips, did not play. Otherwise, they would have gotten shut out.
Well, they still got shut out, actually.
Oh, they did play.
No, I'm saying that even by not playing, they still got shut out.
Yes. Akron, easily your candidate for the worst team in college football, and I would be derelict in my duty if I didn't give a shout-out to New Mexico State.
Covered!
Against Incarnate Word, which I'm not exactly sure what level Incarnate Word even plays in.
Let me check, and I will tell you, because they've kind of, I don't know if they're FCS independent or not.
Or Division 2 or Division 3 or NAIA?
Well, no, they started out as an NAIA. Okay, they are in FCS. They're in the Southland Conference now.
Oh,
in
wow.
In 2013, they started in 2009. They originally started Division 2 as members of the Lone Star Conference. 4 years later, they moved to Division 1. They're in 1AA in the Southland Conference. And that was my underground pick of the week for those of you that believe in turkey and stuffing and whatever you would take from your Thanksgiving table.
For those of you who believe in miracles.
Yes, and so let's on this one for me, I would have put the cranberry in a can on New Mexico State, because New Mexico State was a 7.5-point favorite. And they won by 13. So that's how confident I was. I would have put the cranberry in a can on New Mexico State. They won 41-28. New Mexico State got the Duke. It's probably going to be their only win of the year.
Probably, yeah. I think that's a pretty safe bet there.
So Incarnate Word was a 7.5-point dog, and New Mexico State won by 13. So I'm a genius. There you go. Carry on.
Yeah, speaking of teams and coaches that are struggling, we need to talk a little bit about what's going on in the state of Michigan.
Yeesh.
Michigan and Michigan State matched up. For those of you who weren't able to keep up with things, the Battle of Michigan, if you will, the Wolverines just absolutely dominated the game, 44-10, in a game that probably wasn't even really that close. Shea Patterson, 24 for 33, 384, 4 touchdowns. But the possibly bigger story here is the storyline here is probably what saith you for the future of Michigan's longtime Michigan State head coach Mark D'Antonio?
Thumbs down, as they used to say in Rome at the time of gladiators and lions that would eat people. So I would go thumbs down if I was a Roman emperor.
And Sparty is really kind of taking a nosedive here over the last few seasons, and it seems to be getting progressively worse. I mean, I don't know if it's a situation where they're tuning him out, where he's not getting enough talent, because they had plenty of talent up there in East Lansing for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And they were competitive with just about everybody, but they haven't been too competitive here of late. And it's looking more and more like, excuse me, I hit the wrong button here as I gulp.
Careful.
The possibility of Michigan State squeaking into a bowl game still exists. Their two games left this season are at Rutgers and versus Maryland, two of the teams in the Big Ten that are outside of Northwestern that are probably worse than Michigan State.
Probably heading to the Pinstripe Bowl or something like that.
Yeah. We're talking early December bowl game.
Yeah.
But the question for again in East Lansing, is that good enough?
No.
I mean,
no.
I give some credit.
I don't think you heard me. No.
I give some credit to the Wolverines, who have played much better here over the last few weeks after really, really struggling at the beginning of the season.
Struggling.
They seem to have gotten their act together as they're now 8-2 going into the toughest stretch of their schedule this season as they play at a spunky Indiana team. I said spunky, yeah, I know.
Well, but that's I mean, hey, they're a 7-win teem right now, so you can't hide on Indiana now.
And they finish with the rivalry game against Ohio State, who is probably going to be number 2 going into that game, barring something.
9-3, and I've seen a lot of folks sit there and point to either an Orlando Bowl game or a Tampa Bowl game for Team Khaki.
Yeah, and again, another question being, is that going to be enough?
Thumbs down from the Emperor, sir. Thumbs down.
Before we wrap up here on the review,
I feel like Dave Bautista at the contract signing. You're like this, and all of a sudden you're just like, no. It'd be a no. But once again, these wins and possibly a 10-win season may create a false narrative for Jim Harbaugh to keep him around for at least another year. So the buyout continues to decrease. So it wouldn't surprise me if the narrative continued that, they're just around the corner, but around the corner from what? Nobody knows.
Indeed. Before we talk about a couple of odd incidents that happened over the course of the weekend, I want to talk about next week's schedule. Got a couple of interesting games, matchups, if you will. The early game on Saturday, Penn State at Ohio State.
Ooh.
Which is not to say that Penn State, I think, is in the same class or category as Ohio State, but it's the closest thing Ohio State has had to a real game this season.
True, yeah. And I still think Ohio State's probably a 10-point favorite to start things off.
And, yeah, they probably should be.
Mm-hmm.
A game that you're looking at as a potential track meet for Ohio State. And as much as everybody's thrown the ball on Penn State this season, that score could get really ugly really fast.
Really fast.
Looking down the schedule here, not a whole lot of other big matchup games.
No, the schedule in the Southeastern Conference, it is legitimately homecoming week in the SEC across the board. I mean, you've got Samford going to the Plains to take on Auburn. It's a noon kick. I think you have Tennessee Martin going to Kentucky to take on the Wildcats. That's the kind of games that we have this week, to be perfect.
Well, the 3:30 SEC game this week on CBS is an unranked Texas A&M team at Georgia. Well, no, I think Texas A&M might have squeezed into the back end of the top 25 this week.
Mm-hmm. Much like Jimbo's hair under his hat.
The Aggies go to Athens for the first time ever to face Georgia.
Okay, and I think, so that probably means that Iron Bowl might be your 3:30 in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I'm thinking it probably will. The only other game really on the board that intrigues me a little bit is TCU at Oklahoma. And I only say this because of Oklahoma's kind of inconsistent struggles over the last couple of weeks, despite the fantastic comeback against Baylor.
Yeah.
Gary Patterson always has his team prepared, always plays some stout defense. They get a few stops against the Oklahoma Sooners offense, and who knows what could happen there.
Right, and TCU, remember, is still fighting for bowl eligibility. They need one more win, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And right now they're 5-5 right now, or 5-5. I think they're a 5-win team at the moment. They need one more before they go on the barn. So that's what Gary Patterson has staring him in the face, and it wouldn't surprise me if they ended up saying first responders or Texas or something like that.
Indeed. What else is going on here in the world of college football?
Oh, Monon Bell. Well, let's talk rivalries a little bit.
Let's talk about some rivalry games.
Monon Bell, as we talked about, and I know that I speak for everyone here. When we put the rivalries and trophy games and rivalries show together, I have to get my phraseology right. It's always fun to do discovery. And when you have, when you have Steve Hoffman, who was in the booth calling Wabash and DePaul as a part of the Fox Sports Midwest, Fox Sports Indiana broadcast, and you have Ken Owen, who ends up being the guy who's a special advisor to the president on campus on his end at DePaul. And he gets to be the guy to toss the coin at the 50 for this game. 126th renewal of the Monon Bell, and you had a 62-yard touchdown pass from Chase Andres to Gavin Ritter with 38 seconds left, and DePaul got the win 17-13 over the Little Giants of Wabash. So when you have great folks in Greencastle, Indiana, getting to watch this one, and it was really cool to put this one together for everybody, but we had to put a bow on that particular one, and so late touchdown pass after a late field goal, 17-13, DePaul over Wabash in the 126th renewal of the Monon Bell game.
Yep, and I got to talk about this week the Bridger Rifle game between Utah State and Wyoming, which ended up being a pretty exciting game. Utah State with a 26-21 win after the Utah State defense forced a late Wyoming turnover. Good game, lots of fun. These two teams really played hard. It's not the hardcore super rivalry that's been played for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
It's really, they've played off and on over the last really century or so because they're not too far from each other, but it's only since 2013 when both teams landed in the Mountain West Conference after galactic realignment.
Round one.
They renewed that rivalry. And Utah State with a good win. They've got a heck of a quarterback out there in Jordan Love.
Yeah.
He threw for 282 and a couple of touchdowns. Great finish to a great rivalry game and got Utah State bowl eligible for the season, which is something when I talked to Jason Turner of the newspaper out there, that was something that they had been pushing really, really hard for. So it was great to see that the Aggies got a win and one heck of a competitive game.
Yeah, so and that's what that show is all about. So for those of you that don't get the opportunity to listen to that particular show, that comes out, as Phil says, it comes out on Thursdays, sometimes Wednesdays, but it opens up a window. Yes, we all know our rivalries that are associated with our alma maters and our footprints, but when we get to talk about the Battle of the Bricks with Miami of Ohio and Ohio U, and when we have Anchor Bone discussed with Grand Valley and Ferris, and when we get to talk about Monon Bell with DePaul and with Wabash, those are the kind of things that are fun about what we do here at the network, and we figured it was something that you guys would enjoy as well.
Last thing we probably need to talk about, and it happened at the game that you were at,
yes,
Jordan Hare Stadium.
Yep.
It was a play that kind of ran out of bounds late,
Yeah.
or not that late in the game, early in the game between Georgia and Alabama.
Yeah.
Brian Herrion running the ball around the corner, and a scary moment when he knocked into Chamberlain Smith, who is a photography intern at the University of Georgia for the Athletic Association, and knocked her cold.
But throw it to Herrion on the corner. Close to a first down. I don't think he got it, though.
This whole drive, except for the swift run right up the middle, the whole drive had been into the short side of the field. They've gone from the left hash all the way down the field.
We got somebody hurt on the sideline, and that's not a good sign.
Yes, it was very scary. And it was a couple of really scary moments there. And there's a still photo that is actually out. And friend of the show, Marvin James from WMAZ, tweeted the photo, and it is a photo of the moment right before Herrion collided with Chamberlain. And Brian Herrion and Jake Fromm, to their credit, Brian Herrion didn't want to leave the area after the collision.
Yeah, he had to be nudged back to the sidelines.
Yeah, and there were a couple of things that were kind of concerning. One, that the officials wanted to continue play before there was some kind of a resolution. It took Jake Fromm, I think, talking to the head ref and actually walking away from the huddle and almost off the field entirely before they got to wait for Chamberlain to be put on the backboard, on the stretcher, and then taken away to hospital. And she spent time at East Alabama Medical. She did have a concussion. She did have some bruising on her face, but she was taken out, and her message has been put out on Twitter for those who haven't had the chance to see it. You also had some fans in the upper deck at Jordan-Hare Stadium who thought that that was a good time to celebrate the fact that it was a good game by Brian Herrien. And you see that in the SEC, and I found that to be disappointing. And after being shouted down, the person finally did get quiet. But then also the tone deafness of some of us in our industry when it came to that particular moment, that to me was one of the more disturbing elements of the whole thing. And I'm just going to phrase it this way. It's disappointing when there are those in our industry and you have moments like that. We're better than that, and we all need to be better than that when it comes to having a product on the air.
Yeah, and as somebody who can speak from experience, who shot college football games for the better part of 20 plus years.
Yeah.
And been on the sideline and been in that vulnerable position in the end zone trying to get where you need to be in order to get that shot and convey the little piece of history that you're trying to record.
Yeah.
You can't always see what's coming in front of you.
No.
And you have blind spots. For me, oftentimes I had a reporter on my hip pocket to pull me away. Sometimes it was you.
Yeah, sometimes it was a man who was grasping the center belt loop of a set of jeans and pulling you one direction or the other.
And you really had to have eyes in back of your head, to the side of your head. I found myself over the years learning to be able to shoot when I knew a play was coming close, to be able to shoot with both eyes open.
Exactly. Having
one staring into the viewfinder and one kind of being able to focus on what's going on around me.
Yep.
Being able to anticipate action, knowing where things are coming helped.
Yep.
And kept me from getting hit really badly. But there were occasions where I got hit.
Mm-hmm.
The one that comes to mind, I actually, because of my size, the player took the worst of it. But
yeah, he did.
And that was a University of Georgia game years ago where I was standing in the end zone only to have then Georgia wide receiver Fred Gibson come tumbling into me after a block. Fred kind of bounced off of me back into the end zone.
That is correct.
I kind of fell into the hedges a little bit, which kept me from going over, and I was able to stand right back up, and I had to ask him if he was okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But that's the exception rather than the rule. I know so many people who have gotten hit just because they're there and that's what the job is.
Mm-hmm.
And there are I know there are a certain percentage of people who will sit there and tell you, well, there shouldn't be photographers on the sideline. They're just blocking the field of play. To that, I tell you, there are more people I can't even begin to tell you how many people that are on the sidelines at a college football especially and a pro football game that shouldn't be there and have just not been had the misfortune of having somebody run into and knock them over on their ass.
Yeah.
I am glad Miss Chamberlain is okay.
Yeah.
I saw the post from her this afternoon. She has a concussion and some bumps and bruises, but she'll be okay.
Yeah.
She wants to get right back out there on the horse and do what she likes to do, what she loves to do, as all of us do.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you who sit there and say, well, you guys have the best life ever because you get to stand out there on a field and watch the game from the field. You don't really get to see the game when you're out there shooting. You get to see what's in your viewfinder.
Yeah.
And a little bit of what's going on around you.
Yeah. And you get to write it down, and you get to write it down on a legal pad.
Mm-hmm. You don't really get to see everything going on, all the atmosphere and everything else, because you're concentrating on the job at hand, and the job at hand is to tell a story about what happened during the game, be it the game itself or individual players or an individual coach or any number of different things that happen over the course of the game. And to do that, you need to be there on the sidelines and in position to do it. And with that, I think I'm going to get off my soapbox because I could go on forever.
Nothing wrong with
that. Let's go ahead and wrap it up. We've talked long enough. For OSG Nelson, I am OSG Phil. You've been listening to the review here on the OSG Sports Podcasting Network. Make sure you tune in on Wednesdays when Brother Wilkie and Twitter and Anthony will have, I can never remember the name of his show. Why can I never remember that name?
What, The Debrief?
The Debrief. And on Thursday, we'll have another episode of the Rivalry and Trophy Game Show, a show I strongly recommend you tune into because it's really good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll be back, of course, next week as we wind down the season. There's, roughly 3 weekends left before we hit Conference Championship Week?
28, it'll be the third. We have 2 more weeks of the regular season. Then we have
Conference
Championship Week, and then we get into bowl games.
Woohoo! It's amazing how fast the season goes by.
I know.
But for OSG Nelson, for Jay Wilkerson16, for Twitter and Anthony, and everybody else here on the OSG Sports podcasting team, I am OSG Phil signing off. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll be back again next week.